session which is on a very interesting topic today. There is a book written, such a thick book. Yeah, it was sort of a profitable book, but the book is the title of the book is very disturbing. The Vanishing Kodavas. And the Kodavas who led the Indian army and still fighting for the nation. And that is a book which is very disturbing title, Vanishing Kodavas, which is written, and the author is with us right now, Kaveri Ponnappa. And last minute, we just thought, just last minute here, that instead of, she's speaking alone, this is Sharmila Rao from Manipal. She thought that it should be a conversation that would be better, when I felt so. And then I requested her that why don't you only do the job. And she has agreed to do that. So both of us, thank you very much for your very last minute helping us in this. But I know the audience is not much, but still the book and everything will be very emotional. Please take it up.
Is this mic working? Okay. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to the Goa Literary Festival for having invited me here. Today actually happens to be a very special day to be talking about the Kodavas, because today is our Harvest Festival. Tonight, sometime close to midnight, back in Kurd, all the clans will be going down into the paddy fields with the music and the drums and the fireworks, and they'll be harvesting paddy, which is in our culture and many others very auspicious. And traditionally, this was the beginning of our year. This was our Kodwa New Year, which of course now has, the significance has changed a little bit. So what I'm going to do is just try and give you a little bit of an overview about Kodwa, because I've been speaking to people, and it's surprising that for us that not many people know about us. I know we're one of the tiniest minorities in the country. We have a very small population, so in a way it's not surprising people don't know about it. But Kodwa has been, it's a very, very ancient land. When I come here and I hear people say that Goa is ancient, the first known reference to Kodwa comes in 2nd century Sangam literature, in Tamil literature. And throughout history, this little place has been an independent entity. Its borders were always being fought over by neighboring, much bigger kingdoms, but Kodwa itself was always, throughout history, ruled by or held together by this an independent confederation of chieftains. Because in Kodwa we're divided into clans, and a lot of the time in our history we spent fighting with each other, but we did manage to keep our place as one unit. And then in the 17th century, after the breakup of Vijayanagar, a branch of a Lingayat royal family came and established itself in Kodwa. And basically we were so busy fighting with each other that we lost our place to the Lingayats, and they ruled us for 200 years. But it was a very close relationship that we had with the Lingayat kings, because they always took their wives from Kodwa families. And I think in a generation or two, they actually were more Kodwa than what they started out to be, although they practiced their own religion, very distinct from ours. Kodwa finally was annexed in 1834 by the British, and this is something a lot of people don't really know much about, but the place was so strategically important that it really it played a key role in the downfall of Srirangapatnam. The British were having a very tough time fighting against Tipu Sultan. Ultimately, it was their alliance with the Raja of Kurd which gave the British free passage through Corfu and supplies, which helped them overthrow Tipu. This little place remained, and it remained a separate state until 1956, when it was finally merged with Karnataka. The people themselves are a bit of an enigma, and I think I've heard more theories about Kodwas and where they came from and their origins than I would care to count. And of course, there's the famous one that they were descendants of Alexander's army, which is factually incorrect. We can't really follow it up. But they definitely are a people who've migrated, possibly from the, most likely actually, from the eastern Mediterranean. And they've come in several waves. It was not one single migration. We have, again, it's very difficult to document this, but we have a lot of folk literature and certain cultural and religious practices which point in this direction. So, I just come on to how they're structured. As a people, they're structured into clans, and these are sort of all clans even today trace their ancestry back to one single founding ancestor, and sometimes to an ancestress. In fact, this is something, women have such a strong position in Kodwa society, and they're so well protected by law and custom, and even if it comes to things like the rights to adoption or inheritance, that a lot of people feel that at some stage in our history we might actually have been matrilineal rather than the other way around. So basically these clans, their lives centered around a unit called the Ainmane, which is the ancestral home, which was sort of very big solid structures set in the wilderness with the paddy fields in front of them, and then your forest all around. And this was, each ancestral home actually is believed even now to house the spirit of your founding ancestor. So they're very sacred places for us. We would not enter an Ainmane without our footwear. We take off our footwear, and there are certain sacred spaces in there, and you would sit in on some benches, and you wouldn't sit on others. So from these Ainmanes, the Kodwas farmed, they hunted, and they fought, because they were warriors, and they were constantly fighting wars with on their borders with Mysore or with Kerala, or they were aligning themselves with other kingdoms around them, and then they feuded a great deal as well amongst themselves. It's interesting for us that the greatest part of our heritage has been handed down orally. We were an unlettered people until the British came to Corfu. But for 1,000 years or maybe more, everything, our customs, for instance, if you were at a funeral or a wedding or a baby's naming ceremony or any custom or practice of ours, a harvest festival, as you were enacting certain rituals or you were doing something or performing a task, there were always people singing about it, and this continues. I mean, at a marriage, for instance, there are four, they're called Duripadkaras, that basically means drummers and singers. They carry these small handheld drums, and they beat on them, and they sing these long ballads. They'll describe, they're very detailed, they describe every ceremony, every nuance of what is happening, and they will tell you, as you're proceeding through a ceremony, they're singing it. So in a way, it was an amazing way to transmit culture to everybody. It's not that only a few people knew about what your customs were. Everybody knew because it was being sung. So this oral tradition, which is still alive, it's still alive in Kodagu today, is what transmitted our culture since time immemorial. So around this you have, we have these clusters of celebrations, apart from weddings and funerals and babies being born in the town. Every single village in Kodagu has a little shrine, maybe 2 shrines, and the lives of those clusters of villages center around those shrines in an annual festival. Now when you look at how we worship, it's quite interesting because we don't have a priesthood. The Kodwas have never had a priesthood. All the ceremonies are conducted by the people, by the community and by the elders. So whether it's a funeral or a wedding or a baby's being named, you just have the people who are conducting all the ceremonies. And at these village shrines, they're very intense. It's a very intense outpouring of faith that takes place. On the surface, many of the shrines have Hindu identities, like you might have Bhagavati or you might have Sartavu. But when you look at the worship, it's very distinctive, it is different. We have taken some aspects of Hindu worship, but I don't believe we can call ourselves Hindu because we don't have many of, the greater part of what constitutes a Hindu way of life or worship, we don't follow that.
We don't have the entire...
Can you please use the mic?
It means, you see, like we say the Kodwas didn't have a Brahmanical cult until the Brahmins came from the north. So I don't think Kodwas have it either.
No, we have absolutely no. We have, it's interesting that there was a big shift in our slightly in a way of life, but certainly worship after the 18th century, because I think almost 3/4 of the population of Kurd was slaughtered in the wars with Tipu and Hyder. So it was so badly depopulated that in fact, they resisted so hard, and Tipu was so furious that when he finally invaded Kurd, he did it with such a violence, and they slashed the forest, and they burnt it, and they tracked the Kodwas down, and he captured thousands of them and took them away to Srirangapatnam, where they were converted and they were part of his army. But they were so determined that when Srirangapatnam fell, they ran away and they came back to Kodagu, and they re-established their way of life. And at that time, the Raja of Kodagu, Todavira Rajendra, he sent his troops down to Mangalore and actually forcibly carried away people and brought them to settle in Kurd, saying, I'm going to give you land, my kingdom is depopulated. But they all became Kodwas. They took to the Kodwa way of life. And at that time, we had an influx of priests who came from, they were Tulu priests, who came and they began to take over the worship of the little shrines which were scattered around Kodagu. So, as a people, we've had an extremely violent and turbulent history. But I think what I found fascinating is that I spent many years in the villages participating in these village festivals which involve trances, processions, oracles, dances, songs.
The same what happens in the Tulu culture. That is with the Brahmin society.
Yes, it's
the oral traditions, the processions.
Yes.
The people, as you said,
Participating as part of the religious ceremonies. But I think what I found amazing in all this, which is documented in this book, And one of the reasons it took so long is because it's very photo-rich. The book is very photo-rich. I found that because ours is an oral culture, things were disappearing. Most of the people I went to were in their 80s and 90s. They were the ones who were the custodians of knowledge of our culture. Many of the famous singers were in their 70s. So there's this sense of urgency to document and record this before it completely disappeared. And while I was doing this, it was interesting. There were two distinct levels that came out. One was this extraordinary culture which had survived into the 21st century, and it was a living culture. It's not that people were just showcasing it, but they were actually living it, and they had a very strong sense of identity and who they wanted to be and what they wanted their future to be. But there was also this tremendous sense of loss and dislocation and a sense of we don't know what the future holds for our community.
So, a general tendency everywhere.
It is?
Again, I see that in the kids also. What next?
I think it is definitely it definitely is a problem in many parts. These last few days I've been listening to people talk, and there are many communities across the world, not just in India, which is facing this. But the problem with us is that we're so small in numbers, because even the census reports are so they fluctuate so much. They swing between 1.5 lakh and maybe 2 lakh people across the total population.
What fact better?
So I think in the context of what we've been hearing the last couple of days, one or two really important things I'd like to say about the Kodwas and small cultures. In fact, at the inaugural the address, there was a debate there about the future of democracy. And there were three things which stayed in my mind, which were cited as something important for democracy. One was plurality. The second was building communities, and then, of course, multiple histories, multiplicity of histories. And if you look at traditional Kodwa society, it is incredible how modern they were. Modern in the sense, truly modern, because they created communities within communities. There was representation for everybody. Every single person in Kodwa society could be represented right up to the top. There were many levels of appeal. Women had an incredible position in society. And because they were so small in numbers, when the British came, they were hardly 17,500 people. So they had learned how to live in complete amity with other communities who also were part of Kodwa. And in terms of religion, I don't think we knew what, because there was so much of acceptance and inclusiveness and tolerance. At some of our most sacred festivals, we had the Jama Matlas for Muslims. They would put on Kodwa dress and dance beside us. And in the heart of Kodwa, there's a beautiful little shrine where the Kodwas, they jointly worship with the Kempati Polyas. They are the local Dalits. But it's a joint worship of the goddess that takes place there. So when I look at this little society and I think about, the future of much bigger societies, I just feel that a lot of the answers might lie in this. Not that I'm saying we can live the way we did 500 years back, certainly not. And it's not just a nostalgia trip. I think it's just looking at the modernity of their thought and their great foresight in carving out a niche for themselves while not not disturbing, including other communities.
Anybody have anything to share, ask? We're talking about a vanishing
community, and lot of us come from vanishing communities.
So please, we have,
Do you see any similarities between the vanishing Kodavas and the vanishing Parsi community? Well, actually we have always intermarried, which is why our population has gone up. And traditionally, as I said, our population has taken such a beating in these wars that we learned very quickly that if we survive, we have to accept other people in. And you will find that a great number of Korwa families cannot trace their histories back more than 200 years, which is about the time, new people came into Korwa. They took on the clan names, they took on the way of life, the dress, the traditions, and the social and cultural practices. So I think from that point of view, we're slightly different.
So then you still can survive, unlike the Parsis who wouldn't.
I do believe, yes, I do believe we can, but I think right now the pressures that we're facing is, I think, you see, our identity, unlike a lot of communities, it's not with a book or a religion. It's very open. It's entirely rooted in the ownership of land. And that is currently under pressure because, as tourism has come to court. So there's tremendous pressure to change the traditional laws of ownership of land. And if we lose our land, we're going to be no different from anybody else. We'll just be,
Even amongst the Parsis, the conversation with Ashti, even with the Parsis, the younger law are very conscious about the need to expand their numbers and are challenging their panchayat, which they call themselves, we need to change. If we don't, we will perish. And they're beginning in different parts of the country to take or respect this request from the youngsters, to say we need to change.
Actually, I have to add one very sad thing which has happened in court. With the good, there's a bad and the ugly as well. Because of this tremendous pressure and threat to our identity with us, amongst some of the younger ones, it's led to something which I think is retrograde. They've become very, very angry and rigid about, these intermarriages. And you hear of cases where they storm weddings and, disrupt them. I think it comes from insecurity because we are so small and we are pretty beleaguered at the moment. So I wish there was a different way, the elders address it differently. The young ones, I think, are feeling threatened by it and they don't want to be as inclusive as our ancestors were. So,
the younger Kulu kids have been feeling that with sort of overpowering Hindu patriarchal being forced, us being the more matrilineal societies, our way of life is getting threatened. And they do feel a whole lot of insecurity. Do you see that in your kids?
The insecurity, as I said, comes from this matter of identity. And I really think if they want to solve the problem, they need to look back a couple of hundred years and see how their ancestors did it. It is through, you strengthen your community when you create little communities within communities and you link up more strongly to the communities around you. The big picture is a very big one, but within your system, I think you can do much more to strengthen your own community because while we talk about external pressures, a part of it is also internal because we need to be determined enough to hold on to, whatever it is of our way of life. Because when you look at these people who were, one of the advantages of the oral tradition was that they always were able to review their history and reinvent themselves. They were not rigid in terms of, a fixed history has been written. They rework their songs, they rework histories. So I think building communities within communities is important.
Tell me one thing, whatever basically you survive on, that thing remains. And whatever you don't survive on, there is a threat. Like in Goa is a tourist place. And we don't market our culture, customs, traditions. In fact, with some bizarre culture it's become our culture, so our culture is under threat. But Kodagu is not like that. Kodagu is basically the greenery in Kodagu, the customs in Kodagu, the cuisine of Kodagu, the culture of Kodagu, even your weddings. Everything is a tourist attraction. We go to Kodagu because of that. So why are you feeling, when you are marketing it and when you are surviving on these kind of things, why are you feeling insecure when actually that is your survival and that is the way you are marketing and your tourism industry is booming in Kodagu?
Let me try and understand. I think you're saying that our culture is attracting tourism and therefore we should be happy about it.
I mean, that will remain because that is become your survival now. The tourism industry is booming because of that and people are coming to Kodagu because of that.
Okay, I'll try and answer this question. This is a loaded one, but I'll try and answer it. We went for tourism in Coorg because of a desperate economic crisis. Coffee had reached a stage of such, what should I say, productivity for the people. Their small girls were in desperate debt. So they thought that the homestay type of tourism would be something that would bring money into Coorg homes. Of course, having been, you've seen what has happened in Goa, that's really not how it works out. There was a stampede for ownership of tourism, in which, yes, some of our people did very well with, the upscale homestays and so on. Effectively, now we have been able to stop any further building of resorts, which was creating a crisis in the district. But in terms of culture, it's a very dangerous, I should say, the ownership of culture goes out of your hands once tourism comes in. Because we become like some exotic endangered species where our religious dances are being taken into 5-star hotels and the poorer people will go because it's a good income for them. But you are depleting your culture, you're not enriching it because you become some kind of a performer. Because even the songs, we have never sung for money in Coorg. It's really looked down upon because it's a great social privilege to be a singer. And the other thing that happens, of course, and this is something, I'm glad you raised this, because your culture actually gets appropriated by a journalist who comes there for 24 hours and who wants a series of sound bites, and they are propagating any rubbish which passes for your tradition and your history. If I were to tell you how many well-reputed magazines have written complete nonsense about the Korwa way of life. So in a way, books like these, I hope, you see, it gets repeated to the point where it becomes a fact. Errors get repeated. So you actually lose ownership of your culture. That's my view.
If I may ask one question here, but you yourself earlier mentioned that about 200 years ago, you merged with your host community, isn't it? By marriages within the communities around.
That was not us. It was the Lingayat kings who came and they ruled Kodagu. They took their wives from Korwa families. And while they retained, this is what I found fascinating about this tiny society, they retained their Lingayat religion, their practices, their whatever it was, and they allowed the Korwas to practice their social, religious whatever, their way of life continued. It's not that they barged in on the Kodwas and said that you must follow our way of life, we're the rulers, we're the kings. And equally, as much as the Kodwas respected the kings and they rallied around them, there was a kind of rally point, they maintained their identity. So it was a good balance that they had.
But now you are saying that it is the younger generation which wants to go back to purities?
I think, as I said, it's not even purity. I think they feel so threatened because, they're very small in numbers, and they see that they're becoming insignificant. In fact, something that I haven't touched on because there's no time, and it's a far more serious issue and a political one. Today, our vote counts for nothing. It's a serious issue. Our voice, this is a cultural, I've spoken only about the cultural, historical, social side, but the Kodwa vote counts for nothing, which is why since 1991 we've had a strong demand for separate statehood, a separate status, which of course I think, I don't think we can get into that now, but there are certain things which have happened in Kodwa. For instance, the chair for Kodwa studies is not in Coorg but in Mangalore. And the one precondition at the time of merger with Karnataka in 1956 was that we remain a separate constituency, and that was, they went back on that promise and now we're clubbed with Mangalore. So effectively, not only are we small in numbers, but we count for nothing.
So you feel swarmed by the...
I think it is a valid concern. It is a valid feeling and emotion.
Just one small thing before we conclude. How do you balance this whole contradiction? Traditionally you are warriors, and still you are so hospitable.
I wish I had the time to read to you the most beautiful passage in the second last Bengal king of Kongu, Lingaraja. He issued 52 edicts from the fort in Madikeri. It was called the Hukamnama. And it is the most beautiful document. It has been created by the Kodwa chieftains and endorsed by the Raja. And one of the edicts is about the treatment of travelers. And I think ingrained in the Kodwa people is this tremendous urge to share and acceptance. They were a very accepting people because they were able to accept all the other communities in Kongu. They fought amongst themselves, they fought wars, but generosity and hospitality was a part of their culture.